Welcome to What is Going for new thought from the edge of Each week on OMTimes flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. There's a piece of advice that's often shared today, particularly in the New Thought Awakening Consciousness arena, and that is, follow your passion, believe in yourself, and the success and the money will follow. Well, if there were a competition for poster child for that approach to life and living, I have little doubt that today's guest would rank highly among the contestants. Judy Piatkus is an entrepreneur, a business coach specialising in conscious leadership, and a former publisher. She founded Piatkus Books when she was in her 20s and grew the company to become an internationally recognised brand before selling it in 2007, just before the global financial crash that she had shrewdly foreseen. Judy Piatkus joins us now to talk about her new book, Ahead of Her Time, how a one-woman startup became a global publishing brand, which chronicles her extraordinary journey from fledgling publisher to a publishing legend and pioneering voice and influencer in the mind-body-spirit field. Judy Piatkus, welcome.
Thank you, Sandie. It's lovely to be here today.
Judy, in 1979, while still in your 20s, with no university degree, no professional qualifications, no financial backing, and no authors, you founded Piatkus Books from your spare bedroom. And you literally taught yourself how to be a publisher while also looking after a young family that included a child with severe cerebral palsy. You had everything against you. Would you kind of regard yourself as a bit of an accidental entrepreneur?
Thank you, Sandie. That's a good question. And I probably wouldn't. I don't think I ever thought of myself as an accidental entrepreneur. And the reason was that I had something to prove. So I think my father would have liked a son. I grew up in the suburbs of London in a very conventional family. My parents were happily married. I had a younger sister. But also my parents were rather old-fashioned. And I think my father would have preferred it if I'd been a son. So as I was growing up, as I was quite bright at school, not academic, but bright, I got into a local school at 11 and I won a scholarship. And so there was an expectation that I would have a career. So as this expectation went on for several years, when I left school, I had something to prove. So I was expecting to do something interesting with my life. And when I was 19, I was working in a low-paid job in publishing, and a colleague and I decided to start a literary agency. We thought we would represent authors and sell their books to publishers. But at that time, we really didn't know what we were doing. But that was my first attempt at being an entrepreneur. So when I did start a company in my fairly early 20s, I was expecting something of myself that I would achieve in the world, but I really had no idea what it would be or no vision as to where it might lead. In the book, I do talk about the fact that I didn't really have a vision as to what I wanted, and I did want to earn money to make my life easier as a wife and a mother. But I had at the same time always expected that I would be able to do that, even though I didn't know how.
So was it publishing because that was what you'd been doing and you knew a little bit about it?
Well, I was always a voracious reader. My mother came home when I was 11 in the school holidays and said, "I've got you a job," which of course was very odd when you're 11. And it turned out that children could work behind the counter in the local library. And in those days, nothing was digitized. So there were little tickets that you put inside the book, and there was a page at the front of the book, and when somebody borrowed it, you stamped the date that they had to return it. So I spent a lot of time in the library as a young woman, and I loved reading, and I loved books, and I knew that I would love to work with books if it was going to be possible.
But still, I mean, there you are with a family, with to care for, a daughter that had special needs, and you're in your loft, and you've got no authors, and you've got no money, and you've got nothing else. You know, where did the courage come from? I mean, you say that you had something to prove. Would you say that the desire to prove something outweighed any fears that may have been, along with that situation?
Definitely. I think there were two things I had to prove. So the first was that there had always been expectations from my family that I would have a career, even though it was supposed to end the day I walked down the aisle with some suitable man whom my parents would probably have chosen if they'd been given the chance, but they weren't. And the other thing was, because I liked a busy social life, I hadn't studied quite as hard as I should when I was at school, so I didn't get into university. So all my friends went to university, and I went to learn to type and to do shorthand. And this was a while ago, because obviously shorthand went out a long time ago, thank goodness, so it's very useful. So I had something to prove to my friends as well, because they'd all gone off to university. They'd had a great time going to parties, meeting each other, falling in love. And there was I going to work as a secretary typist every day. So I had a terrible chip on my shoulder about all this, which I tried to hide. But I definitely was expecting that there was going to be something to come out of all of it. So yes, I do say that it takes courage to be an entrepreneur, but I think it takes more courage to be an entrepreneur when you're older. So when I started my company, I was married and my husband was bringing in an income. It wasn't huge because he worked for the NHS, but it was going to keep the roof over our heads. If I had failed, I wasn't risking the house. I didn't have a loan set against our mortgage. I would still have had to work if I'd failed, but there would have been some money coming in. I think the courage is that you're constantly having to get out of your comfort zone. You can't be there at all, and you're having to do things that you haven't done before, and you're having to solve problems, and you're having to speak to people and make cold calls. That was something I found really difficult. So all those things required lots of courage, but I'd made up my mind. And I had also run a company with a partner before I started on my own, so I probably had something to prove to him as well, though I can't remember quite that far back. So I was determined to succeed, and I was very focused on publishing lots of wonderful books.
One thing that's clear from your book is that you seem to have a really, really good sense of timing. You seem to be just ahead of the curve at so many points in your life. I mean, you were definitely a pioneer because, you know, apart from everything else, you also had the handicap of being a woman. And there weren't that many female entrepreneurs, and there certainly weren't that many women in publishing, not at that level.
Well, I think really, as I'm speaking to this particular program, I think I can say that I probably came into this lifetime, and this was what I was probably meant to do. Of course, I
Exactly.
knew nothing about any of this at that time, because at that time, as I began my publishing company on my own, the second one, because the first one was with my partner, who was not my husband, but as I began Piatkus Books, which I started on my own, I was publishing fiction. And it wasn't until several years later that Piatkus, by then we had, by then I had colleagues, so I wasn't on my own. It wasn't until several years later that we began to explore the self-help area and the mind, body and spirit area, which at the time was called New Age. Now, in England at that time, this particular area of the marketplace was viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. And so I think it was part of my purpose in life, in this lifetime, that my colleagues and I were going to help to open up the market, open up people's minds to new ways of thinking about the mystic world that surrounds us. And so perhaps it is for those reasons that I was given the skills and the qualities that were needed to do that.
Well, I'm a firm believer, actually, that we do come in with everything that we need, and it's just a matter of us following, the little breadcrumbs that we get from, our interests and our passions, and that little voice inside that points us in certain directions and tells us when to say yes and when to say no to certain things. And you've just confirmed that for me. As I was reading the book, I was thinking, yeah, you were definitely guided throughout this. I mean, you've just done some amazing things there. I remember that time. And in fact, you and I actually lived in the same town at one point. But I remember being one of the few people I knew that was into the mind, body, spirit arena. And your books were the ones that, I gravitated towards because there weren't many others.
We did have a wonderful time. Early in around 1990 in the UK, there was a recession, and it was the first time in the UK that people no longer felt that they had a job for life. So some people have been working for their company or organisation for a very long time, and business became very tough, and many people were made redundant who'd never really found themselves in a position where they had to go looking for a job, and that was both men and women. And it took 2 or 3 years before things got easier again. So at Piatkus, we began to publish business books so that people could improve their skills to keep the jobs they had, or they could gain new skills to try and get new jobs. And then after things got easier, it's going to be a bit the same with the pandemic, of course, then people were able to sit back and they were able to think, why has this happened? Why has this happened to me? They were able to take the time to reflect on the trajectory of their lives. Why has it gone in this direction? And so introducing mind, body and spirit books to the marketplace was the perfect time in England. And I keep saying in England because, of course, in America you were far more advanced. And in other countries that we sold books to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Far East Europe. All these countries were much more advanced than we were in the UK. And I think one of the reasons was that the UK is a very long-established country, and we've got people who can look at their genealogical charts and trace their ancestors back for 1,000 years. But in countries where there's an immigrant population, people have always had much more of a can-do attitude, much closer to nature, much closer to the challenges that many in the UK struggled with at this time. So it was the perfect time to introduce all these new ways of thinking in the UK. And I do say in the book that we were ahead of the curve because most other publishers weren't entirely comfortable publishing in this area. And so we did have people who had lots more money than we did, but there were plenty of books to go around for all of us.
Well, one of the things that I find quite delicious is here you are following these promptings, which I do think, came from your soul. And as you are learning about publishing, you're also moving into an arena that's providing you with all the tools you needed for your own spiritual growth and development as well.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't really come into I was in my early 40s when at Piatkus we published a few self-help books. We published books about alternative health, reflexology, aromatherapy, shiatsu, meditation. But we hadn't published so much in the mind, body and spirit area. And I was in my early 40s when I read my first mind, body and spirit book, which an editor had brought into the company, and it was The Power of Gems and Crystals by Susie Holbeach. And then new books began to arrive after we published that one, and I found them all fascinating. I was having a wonderful time, and I remember going into the bookshop the very first time after I'd read The Power of Gems and Crystals and looking to see what was there, and it was one of the very big, great bookshops in London, so there were more titles than in most bookshops. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, there's a whole world of books here, and how come I've only just discovered it? So that was very exciting.
Yeah. You talk about when you read The Dance of Anger, which is a favourite book of mine, and I must have read it round about the same time, and what an impact it made on you in being able to stand up for yourself. I mean, that was for me, that was a breakthrough book.
It was a breakthrough book for me as well. And I remember I read it when I was 37, and I was able to say to my mother that I didn't want her to be quite so critical of me. I mean, now that I'm older and I look back at my mother's life, I can see that she had a mother who was critical of her. So she thought that was part of mothering. I mean, it wasn't that she didn't love me. But for me, I was never entirely comfortable being open with my mother because she was so critical. So for me to find the courage, that required courage, to say to her, Mum, I'm 37 and I don't want you to be so critical of me anymore. I got that from reading The Dance of Anger. Yeah. And that has stayed with me all my life, that particular conversation, which was really a watershed for me because it was probably the first time that I'd asked my mother not to do something like that.
It's a book that I recommend to friends again and again and again. But you weren't just a pioneer in that you were bringing the mind, body, spirit and making it respectable as well, for people. The culture that you created, the way that you led your team, your flexible workplace policies, etc. They were all pioneering back at that time as well.
Thank you. I think it was just that I'm very pragmatic, and I had really hard-working, committed colleagues working with me, and I wanted to keep them. And I had 3 children, so I understood as well as any boss could possibly understand how difficult it was, getting them ready for school before you came to work and having to rush home to meet them off the school bus. Usually I had a live-in nanny, but of course there were times when the nanny left, a new one started, or they were ill, so I had to be there. So I understood that all the other mothers and the fathers as well sometimes had to go and be there for their kids. Sometimes they did need to work from home. Sometimes they did need to change their hours. And we were always very flexible about that. And I think people felt great affection for us because of it. And also, there weren't so many rules and regulations in the 80s and 90s. And one of my colleagues, Simon, as new laws came into existence in the UK governing the workplace, he was charged with the task of creating a book with all our policies in it. So when we started, we didn't need many policies, And then over the years, the book turned into a whole Bible. So definitely we were ahead of the curve, offering flexi time, offering parental leave to fathers quite early, and just seeing all the people who work with us as people with their own lives, which we wanted them to be able to live an easy life in regard to the workplace, because we thought they would work better. So we were being pragmatic as well. I mean, if your staff aren't happy, then, if there's something you can do, if you want to keep those staff, that is, we don't always want to keep everybody, but for the staff that really work hard and are committed to what your company is offering, then if you want to keep them, you want to make their lives easier and not more complex.
Yeah. And at the time, did you truly understand that you were ahead of your time?
I don't know if I thought about it that much. If I met with colleagues who worked in other publishing companies, I think most of the time we probably talked about books. I'm not sure that we would necessarily have talked about company policies that much. I did always become very aware of the fact that we had that we had a different kind of structure for staff in the UK than in America. I used to go to America once a year on a book buying trip, where I would meet with publishers and literary agents, particularly in New York, but sometimes at book fairs. And so we would chat about the different ways that our lives were structured. So I sort of got to hear about I think they're called public days, when you can have a day off for the plumber or the dentist. So we don't have those in the UK. But the UK is much more generous with maternity leave and much more generous with holidays, definitely. So I think, I actually was more grateful than anything else, and was perhaps more likely to be comparing what we were doing in the UK to what was going on in America.
Yeah. We're going to go to break now, Judy. We'll be back shortly. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is entrepreneur and business and conscious leadership coach, Judy Piatkus, who founded Piatkus Books when she was in her 20s and grew the company to become an internationally recognised brand. We're talking about Judy's memoir, Ahead of Her Time. We'll be back with more from Judy Piatkus after the break.
The future of Internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the Internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Furman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
Mental health. Most people think it means mental illness. Most people are wrong. Mental health doesn't apply to just some of us. It applies to everyone. We're all susceptible to anxiety and depression. They're human conditions. And no person should ever feel embarrassed, ashamed, or be discriminated against for being human. Cracked the podcast strips away the shame, fear, and stigma by expanding the conversation into areas less often visited. From brain and body chemistry, hormones, food, nutrition, trauma, and the microbiome, to pharmaceutical drugs, psychedelic substances, meditation, visionary experiences, and spiritual awakenings. Cracked the podcast will explore them all, including the notion that, for many, breakdown can be the beginning of breakthrough. For in the words of singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, there is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. Cracked the podcast, Slaying the Dragons of Mental Health. Join co-hosts Sandie Sedgbeer and Rebecca Shaper on the first and third Thursday of every month at 12 noon Eastern Time.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. Judy Piatkus, after creating this incredible global brand and pioneering, so many things, the way things were done, you sold the company in 2007. What is your view of publishing today? I mean, as you say in the book, there weren't that many books published back in the 80s, not as many as there are today. But today, we've got digital, we've got self-publishing, which is now becoming very legitimate when it used to be considered a vanity project. What do you think when you look at how it's shifted and changed?
Well, the first thing I think is that I'm very happy not to be a publisher at this time. So I loved publishing. I really loved. I had Piatkus Books for 28 years, because I started young, and I loved every moment of it. And I had very few sleepless nights, for which I am extremely grateful. Because that's one of the hardest parts of running your own business. When I look at publishing today, it has changed hugely since 2007, when I sold the company. So in 2007, so that's 13, 14 years ago, in the UK, people hadn't realised that we were about to be offered the Kindle. They hadn't realised how powerful Amazon was likely to become. And so those things changed the industry massively in the first few years after I sold the company. And it took quite a while for people to adjust in publishing companies, because publishing companies had to go out and find people who understood digital, because they needed those people to help produce the books. They were being produced differently, and they needed those people to help market, because social media was growing, because social media really hadn't got going in 2007 when I sold the company. Mark Zuckerberg really only sort of created it, I think, in 2005. So the social media was really still in its infancy. It's grown very fast. So that took a long time for publishing companies to adjust to. And people who had gone into publishing at that time usually went into publishing because they didn't want to work with technology. They wanted to work with words. And so adjusting to publishing via technology took longer than it might have for publishing people. So now that I'm in the position of having published a book myself, I've had the opportunity to see about what the changes are like. And of course, the first thing is that you can buy a book and you can download it onto your Kindle. You can buy the printed version. My book's available as an audio, so you can listen to it. And most books now are published in audio format via publishing companies, and that wasn't the case until very recently. And then the way that you connect with your customers, with your end reader, is so different now. So my publishing company, Watkins Media, sent out a lot of early proof copies to lots of lovely people, publishing hopefuls, people who want to work in publishing, and people who love reading easy-to-read memoirs, which my book is, I hope. And so people started to comment on the book on social media. And although I'm quite active on social media, I found that really terrifying at first. In fact, nobody said anything unpleasant. But the fact that people could connect with me directly and tell me what they thought of my book, that was really a new experience. And I found that really fascinating. And I think you need a lot of courage nowadays to be an author. And you have to be on social media, and you have to have a platform. And if you're not on social media, you've got to have a very powerful platform in other ways to persuade a publisher to take your book. So many publishers will only take a book on if they know that an author has a really good platform and they're going to be active on social media. So that's massively different from what it used to be. And that makes it very tough for new authors. So if there's any new authors, whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction, and you're listening to the program today, if you don't have a powerful social media platform, then you must find out how to create one and start it immediately, because it takes quite a long time to build up your following. And if you want to be published, your readers want to find you on social media as well as through other places.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite different. In fact, it's interesting that publishers won't touch someone if they don't have a platform. But quite often you'll see somebody who will self-publish, be very successful. Then the publishers come in and say, okay, now we want to offer you a deal. So it's kind of completely switched the power base around, I think. After a while, I could see how lovely it was, because I had some early readers get in touch with me and tell me how much they'd enjoyed the book. And there was one particular young woman in her 20s who had a sister with disabilities. And she wrote that as I wrote about bringing up my daughter, she really identified with us as a family, and she'd found that really helpful. And I thought, even if there's no one else in the world who enjoys the book, I'm so glad that she's found it and read it, and that it's been helpful to her. So what I found is that everybody gets something quite different out of the book, and it is lovely hearing from different readers as to what they found interesting. So younger people are learning about publishing. People who want to start businesses are learning how to start their businesses, and older people are having a trip down memory lane, especially in the mind, body and spirit area, because I write about so many authors who so many of your listeners have probably got on their bookshelves. At Piatkus, we published a lot of American authors, and we would sometimes invite them to visit us in the UK and do the publicity tour, because of course you couldn't do it digitally then. So authors really did have to make the trip to their markets to build their profiles. So it was a very different time. Yeah, a very different world. Very different world. What was it like for you after so many years in publishing to write a book?
Well, after I sold the company, a year or two later, I had a go at writing a book, and I sent it to a couple of literary agents, and they weren't very impressed with it. And I really hadn't gone about it the right way. And then 3 years ago, I put the idea out of my mind. I don't think I looked at it again. 3 years ago, I found myself having an unexpected session with a woman who does scientific hand analysis, which is also familiarly known to people as palmistry. And she looked at my hand, and I think she was channeling information at the same time. And she said, "You've got a book here. You're meant to be writing. You have got a message. You've got things to say, and you need to get it out there." And I think that there was a part of me that knew that I did have things to say, and that I did need to write a book. So during 2019, I made this my project. And after I'd written about 45,000 words, that's sort of that's a short book or half a medium-sized book, I sent it to an editor, who I respected, and I said, am I wasting my time or shall I carry on? So she gave me some guidance, and I went back to the computer and finished it, and then I sent it to her to copy edit it, not to edit it, not to ask lots of questions about things that I'd put in there, but just to improve my English slightly, which she did. And she also cut 20,000 words. So this was quite a shock. And I thought, well, if I had the publishing company now and we chose to cut an author's work by 20,000 words, we would hope they would agree with us. So I simply accepted her guidance, and I then found a literary agent, and she found a publisher for me. So I went about it in a much more professional way, but at the same time, this is a better book than a book that I would have written 10 years ago, because I had 10 years to grow as a person. And so when I looked back on my publishing career, I was able to make much more sense of it. And what was interesting was, as I was writing it, and I was writing it in it's a linear story in the way that I've put it in the book, though I didn't write it in a linear way. But I found that so many memories of unexpected events were coming back to me. And it was like I'd wake up in the morning and my head was just full of what had happened 15, 20, 30 years ago. It was quite extraordinary. So I do recommend the process of writing to anyone listening, because it does help you to understand your life better, and it helps to sort out any confusion you might have.
Absolutely. So you became a bereavement counsellor, you studied psychodynamic psychotherapy, and in 2011 you founded Conscious Cafe, a network that brings people together for connection and discussion. And now there are conscious cafes all over the world. Tell us the inspiration behind that.
Well, I've always been a connector. I've always loved bringing people together. And after I sold Piatkus, I was really missing my colleagues and the lovely authors who I'd met. And I wanted to have more conversations about consciousness and mysticism and how we live. And I just wanted to have conversations. I didn't necessarily want to sit in a workshop, although I was doing a few workshops. But I wanted to meet people. I wanted friends who were more conscious. So I invited about 50 people to my home, and 25 came, and we had a discussion about what is consciousness. Everybody enjoyed it, and we decided that we'd run another one. And that was 10 years ago this summer, and I've been running Conscious Cafe since then. And for the first few years, we had the most amazing group of really thoughtful people, the ones who were giving the workshops in the UK. And then gradually people moved on with their lives, which happens with all networks. So we got many more new people coming, and it's always been wonderful. But people who were coming were sometimes coming from 2 hours drive away, and they said to me, could we start a group in our own town? So we had groups in different parts of the UK, and then a lovely lady contacted me from Switzerland, and we started a group in Geneva. And a lovely lady who had been coming to my London group found herself in Singapore and missing conscious conversations, so she started a Singapore group, and it's been growing from there. So it's not huge at any one time, but since the pandemic, we've gone online, and now everybody can attend a Conscious Cafe event online wherever they live.
Will you return to in-person meetings at venues? Do you think once all of the, everything returns to, we can get offline for a change?
Well, we've just dipped a toe in the water. I think our Singapore group has had one meeting where everybody met, but now Singapore's back in lockdown. Our Geneva group has brought everybody together in the park in Geneva, which people have enjoyed. Our Canterbury in England group is about to run a session where they're all going forest bathing. So we're doing it slowly, starting outside, but our Skipton and Yorkshire group is hoping to have something inside. But when we have something inside, we all have to have fewer people. And the way Conscious Cafe works is that we leave everybody's a volunteer except our administrator, and everybody runs the group in a way that suits themselves. So I'm leaving it to each group leader to decide when they're comfortable to meet indoors. I'm not entirely sure when that will be for the London group, which I run, as my husband has asthma, so I am very careful. And even for those who've had the vaccine, we've been told in England mixed messages. So I think we've all got to carry on being careful for a little while longer.
Yeah, I must, while we're talking about the pandemic, I must quickly mention a little piece in your book, because you actually published Dean Koontz under a pseudonym that he was using at one point, and one of his books that you published is the book that was going all around the internet last year, with everyone saying, my goodness, Dean Koontz has this whole passage where he predicted the pandemic all those years ago.
Yeah, that was an amazing novel. Actually, it was amazing because it was so thrilling. And he wrote it and published it at that time, which was the 1980s, under the pseudonym Lee Nichols. And we'd published it as a hardback for libraries very early in Piatkus's life. But the other book we also published, apart from that Lee Nichols one, the other book that foretold a pandemic was by the psychic and mystic Sylvia Brown. And she'd also foretold that there would be a pandemic. And it was quite interesting because she said, and I can't tell you which book it's in because I don't have her books here any longer, she said that the pandemic would come very, very quickly and then it would go quite quickly. Well, I'm not sure if it's going that quickly, but hopefully it won't last too long.
Yeah, it's really interesting when life starts imitating art. And that's happened before, though, hasn't it? I mean, I think it happened, was it Herman Melville, one of his books? I mean, there's been several books that I've read about where there have been instances, Edgar Allan Poe, and they've repeated themselves in life, even with, the same names, years and years later.
It's really interesting how we sort of get these deja vus and glimpses and hundredth monkey. And astrologers would say that, of course, we see these repeating patterns with the planets,
yes.
And that's very indicative of all kinds of repeating cycles that we'll all experience.
Is there any book that you look back on and wish that Piatkus had published?
I wish we'd published The Dance of Anger. And we could have published it, except that at the time we weren't going to be allowed to sell it in Australia, which would have contributed to making it more profitable. And I wasn't sure if we'd make it profitable if we didn't sell it in Australia, so we didn't make an offer. And I bought a copy and sent it to a friend a few weeks ago. It's been in print all that time. It's by an author called Harriet Goldall Lerner. And it's been in print all those years, so I got that wrong. There were lots of books that we failed to buy because it's such a risk and a gamble being a publisher. But then there were books that we bought that other publishers turned down. So the scales eventually sort of weighed fairly equally.
If you were still in publishing, what kind of book would you most like to publish? Something that maybe you feel the world badly needs?
Well, there are so many books published all the time, every day, everywhere in the world. And I think the most important book for every individual reader is the book that you're reading at the moment, the book that you're choosing to read next, and the book that really is life-changing sometimes. So as a publisher, I would say we published more than 3,000 books, and if everybody who read them got something different out of them that benefited them, then I'm happy to have published that book.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it, books? Books, you can get many books that are saying the same thing, but one book will come along at a particular moment in time that somehow says it in a different way, that really taps into, what people need at that moment, and then it becomes a big success. That always fascinates me.
Yeah, I think all publishers find it fascinating. For example, in the UK recently, in fiction, we've had all these sort of dark psychological thrillers, and they're very domestic. And I think everybody is eagerly waiting to see what's going to come next. One of the things I write about in my book is how we had different periods in fiction. We had chiclet in the 90s, and then we had different kinds of fiction at different times. And of course, it would have been exactly the same in America. And those lucky authors who write the perfect book, which is published at the perfect moment and hit the jackpot, well, none of us can plan it. It's just the way that the cookie crumbles, really. And it's very exciting if you're the publisher and the author of that particular book, and it's just very tough on everybody else. Sort of 99% of publishers and authors rarely have that extraordinary book in their experience, and it just happens very rarely, but it is interesting when it does.
I find it interesting too how, books kind of reflect societal changes before we're even aware of them. I mean, you look at films and books, the dystopian ones that we've gone through over the last 10 years, and we're moving into a time that is looking a little bit more dystopian. Or you might get when the choose your own adventure books came out, long before the fantasy genre was a genre as such, kids were reading, my son certainly was, choose your own adventure books, and that for them developed a lifelong interest, many of them, in fantasy books. And then you get Magic the Gathering, and these kids all go into these events when they used to be able to go to events where they're dressing up as characters, and then all the games that they're playing. It is interesting how books seem to sometimes be ahead of the curve and showing us what's coming next.
Yes, I think that's true. But I think you've also raised another point, which is that there is a massive industry that is the games industry, which is often sort of streets ahead of the book industry, which is so much smaller. And of course, all of us are influenced by the games industry, and often in ways that we're not aware of. But certainly, everybody who's living with children knows a lot more about how children are influenced by all these things. It's much more expensive for book publishers to engage in these areas because we don't have such a big market. But of course, the gamification of life is massive.
Yeah. But you wouldn't ever consider going back into something like publishing again now?
Well, I'm not planning to start another publishing company. I can't imagine anybody would want to hire me. And even if the thought crossed an employer's mind, I suspect I'm fairly... I'm not somebody who's going to be able to work for anybody. And I'm not sure I could be a consultant because I've been out of the industry too long. But nevertheless, none of us know what's in store for us. And someone else asked me just earlier today, what do you think you're going to do next? And my life has been full of unexpected twists and turns. So I'm just waiting to see what's going to arrive.
Will you write another book? Have you got that bug?
That's another question I was asked today. I was actually writing a blog for the Romantic Novelists Association, and those questions were in the blog, and it hasn't gone out on their site yet. And I think it's just, I think if write wouldn't be about publishing, because that was a complete book, my memoir. It would be quite different, and it would be more about my spiritual life. So I think it would. I think what I would do would be write the book and then see if the publishers were interested. I wouldn't be looking for a commission, because I wouldn't myself know how it would play out. But it would be a treat for me to make the time to explore it for myself. But there are so many good spiritual books out there, so I'd have to think very carefully whether I had anything to say that other people would want to read.
Well, as I said earlier, there's always someone who wants to read them. There could be 10 books all saying the same thing. There's always going to be a book that appeals to, many different people. But I think a book about, the spiritual development alongside, I find that fascinating, that even as you are producing it for everybody else, you're educating yourself and you're preparing yourself, for the rest of your life as well. When you look back on your life, the trajectory, and you kind of connect the dots, do you marvel at the perfection of the way it all turns out?
I feel incredibly grateful. I feel very, very grateful to have been given the life that I've been given. I feel grateful that I have food, that I have shelter. And I remember once hearing an American very successful politician speak, and actually what she said is, be aware that most of the world, or many parts of the world, when someone wakes up in the morning, they do not have running water. And that has always stayed with me. So I think I've really been given so much in this lifetime, and I hope I've had the chance to give something back. So there's a sort of theme going around now about those of us who are in service to others, which is probably a large number of people listening to this, and those of us who are in search of themselves. So maybe I'm an older soul, not in search of themselves, in service to themselves. So I think maybe I'm an older soul, here to be helpful to other people. And I feel grateful that I've had the opportunity to enjoy so much in this life. Although, like everyone else, there's always hidden pain. We all have hidden pain, and we all have challenges, and we all have lessons to learn. So that even having what I've been given hasn't always meant that the path was straightforward, because it isn't like that for anybody.
No. What would you most want people to take away from your book?
Everyone takes away something different, but I want to say to people, weigh up risks, but if you want to give it a go, because you never want to look back and think that you didn't try something. Work out how you can do it. It might take you longer than you would ideally want. You've got to save up some money so that, you've got rainy day money to fall back on if your enterprise doesn't work. But if you want to work for yourself, give it a go. And if it doesn't work out, because it doesn't always, you will know that you tried. But when you're older, when it's harder because you have less energy, you don't want to look back and think, I should have tried. Because that's always very sad. But nevertheless, even if you do think I should have tried, then have a look and see what you did instead, and I'm sure you'll find something good to compensate you, because it is a challenge going out on your own, but do it if you can.
Good advice. Judy Piatkus, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Me too, thank you. Ahead of her time, How a One-Woman Startup Became a Global Publishing Brand by Judy Piatkus is published by Watkins Publishing, and you can find more information about Judy at her website, judypiatkus.com, and about the Conscious Cafe at consciouscafe.org. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back again at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me.